If there is one garment from history that I think should be brought back immediately, it is the shift, or chemise, or smock, whatever you call the underlayer of clothing that sits next to the skin. We have underwear now, most of us do at least, but it's just not the same. I want to make a chemise worthy of being an outer garment in a modern world. Immediately you may say, that's a shirt. You've just described a shirt, and fair. Yeah, men have actually held on to this idea more than women, I think. My partner wears undershirts or white t-shirts under everything, and a button-up collared shirt that men, and all genders, wear beneath suits can be traced directly back to the male equivalent of a chemise. At some point in this collection I'm developing, I will definitely be making some straightforward button-up shirts, but for now, I just want to play. Deconstructing and draping with existing garments is my preferred method of silhouette development. And in this case, maybe I was a bit inspired by Phoebe Philo. I had a strong reaction to just a simple backwards men's shirt. It's really the way the yoke cuts across the chest, I think. This gave me some ideas for a cutting layout. Maybe the coolest part of these underlayers is that they're almost always zero waist. I've explored a few different cutting layouts in the past, and there are even more laid out in Cut My Coat and Patterns of Fashion 4, but I think I'm ready to be adventurous. I played around with creating a single strip of fabric that would run across the chest and give me a similar line to the draping experiment, but I'm not feeling ye old T-shaped smock for this particular project. So I worked with the shape created by the skirt flare to create a sort of shoulder gore. Since the body is then flared out, the top of the body piece has a squared top for the underarm gusset to sit. I imagined this to give me a wide shoulder, maybe even a bit off the shoulder. It's kind of amazing how these numbers and the math works in this. The shoulder gusset is defined by the skirt flare, which is dependent on the fabric width and so forth. Oh, and one other thing. I am going to try to make all of these patterns openly available. A couple of things to note about that. I am not a professional pattern maker. I will be transferring my patterns as is, as best I can, to Illustrator and then into a PDF, but they will be in my size only for right now, and they will definitely not be the polished professional pattern you may expect from a professional pattern maker. If in the future I find myself better funded, then I will absolutely look into someone to grade and shine up the patterns. But for now, at least, it's just me doing this in my spare time. Because of that, the patterns will be free and available to download from my shiny new website, which is also going to be developed in real time. You know, transparency and all. They will be in PDF format and in actual size, meaning the PDF is life size. You all can then use your favorite tile printing technique to print them out and work from them, or bring them back into Illustrator to manipulate them. Let the grand experiment begin. I used a printed gingham bedsheet for the fabric. I really love gingham in general, and unfortunately this bedsheet had some holes in it. But I think the tight weave is actually pretty close to the tightly woven linen of some of the extant smocks I have in my archive. I did not make a paper pattern for this. I just used the measurements and helpfully squared gingham print to mark the pattern directly onto the face of the fabric. The pattern wasn't zero waste in that it didn't use up the entire bedsheet, but it did leave behind very usable rectangles of fabric. Okay, I'm going to go through this in my actual order of operations so that what you're seeing on screen matches what I'm saying, but I'll also tell you the order of operations I should have used. No foreshadowing there or anything. With a chemise, I'd normally begin by attaching the underarm gusset to the sleeve, but because the sleeves were one long sleeve, I began by attaching the underarm gusset to the top of the front body. Right sides together. These seams were eventually finished with a fell seam, but I first sewed the other side of the gusset to the top of the back body and the long side seams below the gussets. As is usually the case with chemise, order of seam finishing was one of the more complex parts of the construction, and I determined I should start by trimming the seam allowance of the entire back body panel, including the gusset portion. I folded the seam allowance of the underarm gusset over the trimmed seam allowance and edge-stitched to create a felled seam. I trimmed the seam allowance of the other side of the underarm gusset and folded the seam allowance of the front body piece over that and the trimmed seam allowance of the back body piece. We all know I love a good deep hem, so I used the existing 4-inch deep sheet hem. Be careful if you do this. We are all very familiar with exactly what a sheet hem looks like, so this can very easily read sheet hem. I edge stitched, creating a nicely enclosed gusset bottom and side seam. Next, I sewed 2 of the triangles together along the diagonal side, right sides together, to create the shoulder seam. There are a few ways I could have finished the neck edge. I chose to finish it with a contrasting bias binding. I sewed the unfolded binding to the short edge of the shoulder gore right sides together. I folded the cut edge in 1/4 inch and flipped the bias binding around to the wrong side. I stitched in the dreaded ditch on the right side of the piece where the self meets the bias binding, which in theory should catch the folded edge of the bottom of the binding to enclose the raw edge. I laid another strip of binding to one side of one of the sleeve rectangles, right sides together, and stitched. The binding should actually stop about 3 inches from the wrist edge. I laid the long, straight grain of the edge of the shoulder gores to the half-bound sleeve rectangle, wrong sides together. You can only see one shoulder gore here, but it's important to do both shoulder gores at the same time. I carefully lined this up so that the bound shoulder gore edges were about 6 inches outwards from center front. I'll mark that on the pattern. I folded the binding over so that both the sleeve rectangle edge and the shoulder gore edge were enclosed and stitched in the ditch again. I similarly sewed another strip of bias binding to the edge of the other long sleeve rectangle. This time the binding went to the very edge of the rectangle. I laid the raw edge of the shoulder gore and the remaining raw portion of the first sleeve rectangle against the partially bound edge of the second sleeve rectangle, wrong sides together. I folded the binding over this entire long raw edge and stitched in the very long ditch on the right side of the second sleeve rectangle where the binding meets the self fabric. This led to a wonderfully bound neckline and a bound seam detail that will define that long chest seam. Next, I laid the body portion of the smock flat and laid the unsewn portion of the back sleeve rectangle to the gusseted top of the back body portion, matching center back to center back. I trimmed the seam allowance from the body and gusset portion and felled the sleeve rectangle seam allowance to enclose the raw edges. I then matched up the unsewn edge of the other front sleeve rectangle to the front gusseted body portion and stitched. I trimmed away the seam allowance from the body portion and gusset and... Would have made my life a lot easier if I'd actually attached the sleeve rectangles to the body before all the bias binding business. Hindsight's 20/20. I could have made it a bit easier on myself and done a French seam here, but it would have looked differently to all the flat-felled seams. So I took a deep breath and felled the long sleeve rectangle seam from the tiny hole created by the wrist opening. While I was at it, I double folded the raw edge of the wrist opening inwards 1/2 inch and edge stitched. I don't love this finish, and I may go back and add a bias binding, but after the felling nonsense, I was over it. Good thing she was done at that point. I can't tell if the resulting shape feels more medieval or 1820s. Either way, I love it. Mine turned out a bit tight around the mid-chest. Nothing too bad, but I've altered the pattern just a bit because I plan to do a few variations of this chemise in the collection. Speaking of the collection, layering is shaping up to be pretty important, and while I do think this is a solid standalone piece, it is but the base layer for one of the looks, so I'll be building on top of it in the near future. If you've enjoyed this variation of history's most staple garment, I always appreciate a thumbs up, and hit subscribe if you'd like to see the rest of this look. Although I actually have the base layer of a different look coming up next. Bye!